Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Yes Corner number 4. Every 2 weeks, we look to try and highlight the amazing resources that we have in the independence movement that will help us win independence. We've been looking at a series of different organisations over the last few weeks, and I'm now absolutely delighted to be able to welcome to Yes Corner number 4, James Kelly.
Hi there, how are you?
Hi James, how are you doing?
Not bad.
Yes, very well. Very well, thank you. And happy Easter, and happy Easter to everyone who's watching.
You too.
Yes, so please do drop us in any comments or questions, and we'll drop them in for James. There's not really been much happening in the last couple of weeks, so I'm sure we'll struggle to chat about that. So first of all, James, you write for the pro-independence blog Scot Goes Pop. It's got a particular focus on polls, and we're going to cover a little bit of that this evening. You also write for a column for The National, and you've written for iScot magazine, and you've been a columnist in the International Business Times and Talk Live radio website, I believe.
Yeah, Talk Radio. Yeah, that's right.
Talk Radio, yeah. Well, we're going to concentrate a lot on the independence and Scot Goes Pop. So before we get into all the details, I'd be really keen to hear from you. How did you get into this kind of murky world of polling?
Well, it's just from the point of view of my own interest, I suppose, in the run-up to the independence referendum. Well, the prolonged run-up to it over several years, because obviously a lot of the polls were extremely bad. Some of them were much worse than others. Some of them weren't quite so bad. And so I suppose I was sort of going through them looking for signs of hope. And I mean, by that point, I was already blogging. I used to, in those days, I also used to post on political betting before I was banned. So if you're thinking about a subject, I suppose it's this natural progression to write down your thoughts. So I started writing a lot about polls, and it just sort of went from there. And then in 2013, I decided to start a poll of polls, because that seemed to me to be an obvious absence in the independence, in the reporting of the independence referendum campaign. There was too much emphasis on individual polls. Always the ones that were particularly good for no, somehow, the ones that were slightly better
became more popular, yeah.
And so we were losing context. So I thought that was something worth doing.
And context is incredibly important. And is that one of the areas where you would say polls has the biggest impact in allowing people to have a little bit more context on what's going on, what has happened, and also what's likely to happen?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the last year or year and a half or so, I mean, it would have been completely different if the polls had been showing something different. The whole thing, the whole basis of this excitement about independence has been the fact that independence has been in the lead in the opinion polls. If that hadn't been the case, there wouldn't have been that excitement. So, in a way, the polls sort of dictate everything. It's almost like they have a constitutional role now, because you see people deciding whether somebody should be in a leaders' debate, depending on whether their party is doing well enough in the polls, or in Northern Ireland, the argument is that the Secretary of State should not call a border poll on Irish unity until the polls show enough support. So an awful lot of weight is being given to polls, which may or may not be accurate. So that's a slightly concerning side of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, they've certainly been legitimised, haven't they, over the last 20 years or so, but occasionally also shown to be completely, I was going to say hopeless. Yeah, completely way off the mark from what people are expecting.
Yeah, it's a problem that's actually got worse, I think. There's been, in the last few years, there's been a considerable number around the world, Israel, the United States, Britain, many countries. There have been a number of surprise election results that nobody saw coming a mile off. So, and that's a greater problem than it used to be. I mean, obviously there have been examples in the past, 1970 in the UK, 1992, but I think it's happening with greater frequency recently. Yeah,
the world's pretty. There's a lot of turmoil, that's for sure, and trying to nail that down into what's likely to happen must be a hugely difficult problem. In terms of Scot Goes Pop and the polling and the kind of regular polling that you do on behalf of the independence movement, what are you planning to do for the rest of the year? Is it going to be more of that, or are you going to hold off, or are you going to do anything different? I know there was rumours of you thinking about doing a podcast. I'd like to know where you are with that. But yeah, what's the rest of the year look like for you and Scot Goes Pop?
I have done 5 podcasts. They obviously haven't made much of an impression, but I have actually done 5 podcasts. I did, yeah. I've had some really good guests actually. There was Yvonne Ridley and Tim Rideout and Denise Findlay and Ellen Hoofer from EU Citizens for an Independent Scotland. And the last one I did
see that one. Anyone in the chat who's seen James's, who's listened to James's podcast, please let me know, because I apologise for not having listened to that.
And the other one was with Miss Punny Penny. That was a good one as well.
Oh, right, okay. And any other plans for the rest of the year?
Well, I'll be doing a poll at some point. Leaving the question of timing slightly open at this point, but yeah, there'll be at least one more poll.
Okay, and is that likely to be before the election?
We'll see about that.
Okay, great. Maybe if someone in the audience asks James that question, he might tell me the answer. Okay, so one of the things that we really keen to do at Independence Live is to try and help us get as many organisations together working with each other. Have you got any examples of how you have done that with other independence organisations, kind of worked together and coordinated things to try and make a bigger impact?
Well, I mentioned doing the podcast with Tim Rideout a couple of months ago. I did run a poll. It was in November actually. It was the last panel-based poll that I commissioned, and so Tim Rideout asked to add a question to that poll. So that was sort of an example of collaboration. Obviously, over the years, I've done a number of films with Phantom Power, and I've done a number of live streams with Independence Live. I've been on Indie Live Radio. I remember a few years ago, I was sort of one of many people that was summoned to a big meeting in Edinburgh by Bella Caledonia, and that was quite an experience. It was sort of like a sit-down argument for about half the meeting, but yeah, that was interesting.
Yeah, that was probably an argument for not just half an hour either, I would imagine, for quite a long period of time. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so I'm going to grab the first one. Now, there's bound to be a couple of questions around Alba. Let's see if we've got any of these. So here's the first one. Let me know if you can see that. Can you see that on screen, James?
Yeah. Do you want me to go ahead and answer it?
Yep, please do.
Okay. Well, I've been out all day, so forgive me if I've missed something really important. But as far as I know, there have only been 2 polls so far that have included Alapa. I'll try and say it correctly. I don't know if that is correct, but Alapa. So the first one was a Survation poll that had them on 3%, which actually people would say that wouldn't have got them any seats, but it might have done, because the problem is that that's a national figure, and so to get a seat in any individual region, you need 5 or 6%. So a national figure of 3% doesn't necessarily preclude the possibility that you're going to be at 5 or 6% in one of the regions. So if it was 3%, you could imagine maybe in 1 or 2 regions they might be at 5 or 6%, and they might pick up 1 or 2 seats. The second poll had them, it was a panel-based poll that had them at 6%, which would be enough to win several seats. But 1 or 2 people have raised question marks about that poll because of the way not so much the way the question was asked, but the way the options were presented. And Alapa were presented as led by Alex Salmond, which is unusual, but you can make a case for that, because if it's a very new party, then is it really that unreasonable to just sort of explain the first couple of times who they are, so that people know what they're actually being asked about? I mean, actually, you could argue they might have been understated if they hadn't done that. So but I suppose there's a question mark over that. But 6%, if that was accurate, would get them several seats.
Okay, all right, that's great. So and that current polling, would you wouldn't be able to do a kind of poll of polls at the moment, but how many polls would you really need to feel comfortable for a good estimation of what Alpa are likely to get? How many polls would you need for that?
Well, how long is a piece of string? You just want as many as possible. You want as broad a range of firms as possible, because obviously you just get the same firm over and over again, then maybe there's a house effect, and so you might be getting misleading results. But you want a few more. You want a few more to get them. And of course, the point is that polls are snapshots, not predictions. And particularly with the new party, there's going to be a question mark over whether they might rise and then fall. Like Change UK, they look like they might break the mold and then just they just sort of disappeared into nothingness. So there's always that possibility with a new party.
Yeah, we've got a really good question here. It's a short question, short answer, please. But I think you've already picked up this idea that firms, everyone does their polls slightly differently. So very succinctly, because I know you're getting good at this now, how are polls conducted?
Succinctly, well, most polls are conducted these days online. That didn't used to be the case. In the past, they used to be conducted face-to-face or by phone. But they're more and more conducted online, partly because it's cheaper and partly because people don't answer their phones in the way they used to. So it's online polling panels. People volunteer. Email invitations go out. They get a representative sample, and they weight the results just in case they don't have a completely representative sample, and that produces a representative number of the population.
I think I often hear people say they've never been asked for a poll. Is there a type of person who's asked for a poll, or is there a set group of people? I know you said people request to be on a poll, but are you likely to be asked for a poll and lead up to election?
I always think it's really odd when people say they've never been asked, because nowadays it's volunteer online polling panels. So if you want to be asked, you've got to join the panel. I mean, if you don't join the panel, you're very unlikely to be asked. Although actually, in my whole life, I have once been interviewed for a telephone poll. So it does happen, but it's statistically much less likely that you're just going to be randomly selected.
Okay, so we've got another few questions coming in, and I've got to say, the Alpha Party's been going for like a week. There's not a huge amount of information in terms of polling, or just over a week, but we're bound to have a few people coming in. So James, feel comfortable to hit us back with the not comfortable answering that at the moment, or I have no idea, or depends. So we've got this idea of a plan for a supermajority of pro-indy MSPs, and Holyrood would be a help or hindrance to achieving both Indy Ref 2. So that's much more of a political question, I think, than it is a kind of polling question. But if you're comfortable giving your opinion on that, I'm more than happy to take it.
Well, a supermajority is not going to be a hindrance. I can't see how it would be a hindrance. The problem might be that if in using a second party to the SNP to get to that supermajority, there is a possibility that you could reduce the chances of an SNP single party overall majority. And so you could get a bigger pro-independence majority, but at the same time lose the SNP overall majority. And some people would argue that that's a problem in terms of trying to get a Section 30 order. It's a debatable point, because we probably aren't going to get a Section 30 order anyway, and so it probably would have to be a plan B. And the way I would look at it is, if there is a substantial number of ALPA MSPs, that would maybe make a plan B more likely. And so arguably it would actually be helpful towards actually getting to the point where we have a choice made on independence.
Okay, that's great, thank you. And someone's being helpful for Gaelic pronunciation.
Gaelic.
See, exactly. There we are.
Well, I think it's something like ALPA. I mean, the ambiguity for me is whenever I hear Gaels pronounce it, I can never tell whether they're pronouncing the B as like a P sound or whether it's a B sound, but it's something like ALPA.
Okay. Well, I'm dealing with Spanish and Catalan in Barcelona, so I've got my own issues over here with those languages. In terms of polling, kind of more broadly, is there anything that's been happening over obviously with having the lockdown and COVID? Is there anything that we kind of look at polls taken over that period and we can kind of throw them out when we start again, or do you still think that there's been kind of pretty consistent and some useful polls come out over this period, which I said has been very different from where we've been previously?
Well, obviously the pandemic has affected the independence numbers. I think it's clear enough that one of the reasons why we don't have it anymore, because the sequence was broken, but for about 9 months there was a prolonged sequence of what was it, 20 odd, I can't remember the exact number, yes majorities, and that was, to me, it was fairly clear that was partly, to a large extent, caused by people seeing Nicola Sturgeon in charge of, actually making really important decisions. It almost Scotland as a self-governing country, people saw what Scotland as a self-governing country would look like, and they liked it, and they thought that Nicola Sturgeon was handling the pandemic better than Boris Johnson. And I think for the first time, the penny actually dropped for people that an independent Scotland probably would actually be better governed than the United Kingdom currently is. And I think that's why we had that sustained sequence in the polls, which is now it's a more complicated picture now, because it's been going back and forth in the last few weeks between yes leads and no leads. It's not like no are firmly in the lead, but it's not quite as good as it was a few months ago.
Yeah, there definitely seemed to be a trend where we were heading towards kind of mid-50s, getting up towards higher 50. I know Gordon McIntyre Kempen, you had a discussion around this, will we get to 60? And, looking back at that point, you said no. Gordon McIntyre Kempen and I both said yes, we can do it. And you were right for the moment anyway, but who knows where we'll be in a few months or 6 months time. I've got a question. I've got a question here. I don't know if this is Roddy, let me know if this is a personal question or a more general question around polling. How do you accurately prevent bias in your polls? I assume that means the ones that you're doing, but in general, I think would be a more useful answer.
Well, I think one thing that's important is because obviously most polls have these supplementary questions, which are written from the point of view of what the client is interested in. So, obviously I, as a pro-independence blogger, are going to be pushing certain lines of questioning that maybe the Sunday Times would not, but the Sunday Times would have more unionist inclined questions. So one thing that's quite important is that the independence question and voting intention questions for Holyrood and Westminster should be asked before the supplementary questions, so that people's answers are not influenced by any, even if it's kind of very mild bias in the later questions. So that's important, and that usually happens, but not always. There's been the odd example of a sort of an unusual question sequence. I remember in the run-up to the referendum, there was an ICM poll that was, for some strange reason, had the independence question lower down the sequence, and it looked to me like maybe that the result had been influenced by an earlier question. So that sort of thing is important for eliminating bias. In terms of supplementary questions, I mean, sometimes bias is in the eye of the beholder. You could probably see bias in almost anything.
There's no regulator for polls. There's no one who oversees it and says you can't ask a question like that. Is anyone free to commission a poll and publish it?
Yes, although most of the credible polling companies are affiliated to the British Polling Council, which has various regulations and guidelines, and so they have to, they follow the British Polling Council rules, which for example are, you have to have the data sets up within a certain number of days, and it's, that kind of thing.
Okay, that's helpful. Well, I'll wait for a few other questions to come in. I'm always really interested by these polls where they have and I never quite understand them, the net popularity score of politicians. Could you enlighten me? How does that work? And again, should we take really any real notice of those types of pollings that take place around individuals rather than parties or policies?
Well, the question that's asked is a bit different depending on the firm, but it'd be like, do you have confidence in this person, or do you think they're doing a good job or a bad job? And so you just subtract the bad from the good, and so you get the net figure. So in recent times, obviously Nicola Sturgeon has been sort of well into positive territory, and there's been this huge disparity between Nicola Sturgeon, who's hugely and a net positive, and Boris Johnson, who's and a sort of very poor net negative. And also Douglas Ross, actually, is nowhere near as bad as Boris Johnson, but he's had negative ratings, which is not good for a leader who should be in his honeymoon period. And to answer your other question, I think it is important because there's some evidence that leadership ratings, like a few weeks or months before an election, are actually a more reliable predictor of election results than the actual headline voting intentions. So for example, in 2011, until quite close to the election, Labour were ahead of the SNP, but if you had looked at the leadership figures, you'd have seen that Alex Salmond commanded much more confidence than Ian Gray, and that was the clue that it wasn't quite as clear cut as it appeared.
That's interesting. I'd like to hear from anyone who's watching anything that they would like polls to pick out that would be helpful for the movement. And one of the things, James, you and I spoke about this a few weeks ago. I said to you, have we any idea? There's a myth that veterans vote no. And I was speaking to Veterans for Independence 2.0, I think they are called now, and they were saying to me, this is a myth. Veterans don't vote no. And I said to you, is there any way of finding that out? And we were struggling a little bit. Is there any way of finding out anything that we can use to our advantage and the polling might help us with?
Well, as I said to you at the time, I didn't know the answer to the question of veterans. If there has been a question along those lines, it must have been a while ago, so I didn't know the answer to that one. I mean, you can poll all sorts of things. You can poll individual constituencies. You can poll special groups, or like you can poll LGBT people, or you can poll European citizens. But it's obviously the smaller percentage they are of the population, the harder it is to find them. So it gets more difficult. But yeah, you can poll all sorts of things.
Because I definitely think that would help the movement if we had some good polls that said actually, people who work in financial services, or veterans, or European citizens, or English parents with kids born in Scotland, all these people who you might think might not vote yes. If we had some polling that goes back to people and say, actually, you're in the majority, it's not just you who thinks that you should vote yes. Is there anything, that's the type of kind of route I'm thinking. Is it a good idea, crazy idea? Is this something that we could think about, this type of approach where we're targeting a group who people would think no, and then maybe do something to kind of put that in a much more positive light?
Yeah, you could, but as long as you got the result you wanted. And I think if you asked probably English parents of children growing up in Scotland, I think you'd find the majority do vote no. It's what you would find is a substantial minority of these people are yes voters, but probably a lot of the time the stereotypes are actually correct. I wouldn't.
That's it, isn't it? Yeah, how do we know? How do we know that the confirmation bias that goes on, and we're all in a situation now, we're so affected by the people that we see around us that we think, of course not, loads of veterans vote yes, but that might not actually be the case. But when we're trying to find some motivation for people who are less likely to vote yes, I just wonder if that would be something. But yeah, I'll take that point on board, that you can sometimes get the result that you don't want. You don't have to show the poll though, do you? Can you not just then park that one? I'll leave that as a rhetorical question.
All right.
We've got a question here from Glasgow. Chris, do you think polling and polls have taken a credibility hit due to recent poor performances and Brexit votes and the general elections? And is that a specific or a more general point?
Yeah, I suppose it's not like polls are light years out. It's not like they're saying that the Conservatives are going to get 25% of the vote and then they get 45%. So they're within a few percentage points, but unfortunately those few percentage points on a number of occasions have made all the difference. And yeah, there's been a whole series of polling failures. I can't remember half of them. They're like 2015. That was the year that David Cameron won his overall majority when everybody was expecting a hung parliament. 2017. Everybody was expecting a thumping victory for the Conservatives, and it was a hung parliament. The complete opposite of what happened in 2015, and Jeremy Corbyn had somehow pulled off the impossible. And also in 2015 we underestimated the SNP, and in 2017 we overestimated the SNP. In 2016, most people were expecting an SNP majority, and there wasn't one. So yeah, there's been a whole series of these surprise results, and it's natural to think, well, if the polls got it wrong all these other times, and of course they could get it wrong in the future.
Absolutely, it isn't an exact science, is it? We've got a good question here from Brendan. Maybe the $40,000 question. The question: how much impact do polls have on the way people vote? I.e., do they sway voters?
I think it's quite hard to know the answer to that. I certainly feared that very much in the independence referendum, that all these the relentless coverage of the really bad polls that made it seem like it was all over, and it was what's the point, why are we even having this debate when we already know what the result is going to be. I thought that was sucking the life out of the campaign and just making it impossible for the yes campaign. But then you'll see what actually happened, and there was this huge swing to yes. So maybe people are more resistant to that kind of thing than we think. I do think at the moment the polling is important, though, because if with the Alapa party asking people for their list vote on the basis that they can produce a supermajority, well, if the polls don't bear that out, then that's going to deter people from actually voting for them. At the moment, they're okay because the most recent polls showed that they would win several seats. But, I think the polls could be quite important determining how people actually vote in the list vote this time.
Yeah, and David has just raised that point specifically with polling is halted during the campaign before an election because it might either distort or depress turnout. Do you agree?
Do I agree that it happens, or do I agree that it should happen?
Yeah, do you agree that it does distort polling? Should we stop it?
Possibly, yeah, possibly. Although, of course, what happens, like in the French elections, because polling is banned in France in the run-up to an election, what happens is the French-speaking parts of Belgium and Switzerland just run polls themselves, so everybody can just go online and see the polls anyway. So you could argue that it's a bit pointless because one way or another people would get around it.
This is a really interesting question based on the answer that you gave earlier about the importance of the leader and the personalities.
Yeah.
So we've got polling shows Salmond's popularity is low, extremely low. Is this a concern for a party which is ultimately based on the personality of one person? So that's kind of flipping that around what you said earlier. And I suppose in terms of concern would be, would they get as many votes as they would had they not have Salmond? I can't really see any other way of looking at it.
Well, I think they would certainly do less well if they didn't have somebody of the sort of stature or the profile of Alex Salmond. So the idea that they would do better if I don't think if the list only party was led by anybody else, if it was a wings party, they would not be in contention for seats. I've always said this. Alex Salmond is probably pretty much the only person that even had a chance of making this work. The point is that he is not.
Before you go, I'd like to hear what other people say. Go and hit me in the comments if you agree or disagree. That would be great. But yeah, sorry, please, James, go on.
The point is he's not trying to win this election outright. This is the point people keep missing when they go back to his personal ratings. If he was trying to win the election outright, of course, it would be hopeless. But this is a proportional representation election, and his aim is to win seats. And he only needs 6% of the vote in any given region to win seats. And his personal popularity ratings are in the sort of realm where that is possible. And the point is, it's not so much, you can forget the people who dislike him intensely, but what you can look at is the people who do like him and how strongly do they feel about that. And that's what really matters. And that's why I do think Alapa do have a chance of winning seats. And I've heard, anecdotally that I think we've seen some evidence in polls that some no voters are thinking about voting for Alapa. And anecdotally, I've heard people say that some no voters are saying they would actually quite like Alex Salmond back in the Scottish Parliament, somebody credible to sort of stand up to Nicola Sturgeon. And people may say, well, that shows you that Alapa are not doing good for the independence movement, but you could flip that and say, well, that actually shows they're bringing no voters across to the pro-independent side. So you could look at that either way.
Yeah, and there's a third thing. You could say that having another heavyweight politician who can affect the SNP and government wouldn't be a bad thing either. Yeah. So there's definitely ways to look at that. But before we finish, polling's all about mathematics. Okay, and obviously I'm just a little bit worried that there's a concern that having a super majority is a bad use of mathematics, but having 85 seats majority in Westminster with only 35% of the vote seems to be a good use of mathematics. Is there any of this kind of making sense to you with this idea that we're in any way gaming a system where in Westminster it looks to be exactly a similar situation in terms of the vote equaling the amounts of seats that you get?
Yeah, I'm not sort of hugely sold on the whole sort of supermajority thing, because I think what we need is a majority. But this is the pitch they're making, and there is a certain logic to it that if they get over a certain percentage of the vote, that they could pull this off. But it could also backfire, and I've been saying this for years that it can backfire, and it's a bit of a gamble. But to me, I mean, I'll be voting for Alapa on the second on the list ballot because they are my first choice party, and in the proportional representation system, if you vote for your first choice party on the list ballot, which is the really important ballot, you know, you can be sure that if they get enough votes, then your vote will be fairly reflected and you'll get the seats that that party deserves. So that's the way I'm looking at it. I don't think you need to overcomplicate it in terms of gaming the system. It's just an opportunity for people to get what they vote for.
Yeah, great. A good question, I think, is coming in from Kevin, because it's not me who's put this question. Doesn't polling so far tell us if the young are going to come out in good numbers to vote? Because I know that is a concern about any party that's doing well, and the turnout will affect desperately the eventual result. Any ideas from where we are in terms of the youth and also overall turnout?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I mean, usually it's fairly standard that young people would be less likely to vote than older people, and the most likely to vote tend to be people over the age of 65. So yeah, I would imagine that's still the case. And one of the sort of jibes that's always made against Alapa is that they are, like sort of older white men, angry white men. Well, if that's a bad thing, well, maybe a good thing for them in terms of turnout, because those are the people who are probably most likely to turn out.
Yeah, they are, unfortunately, in our society, the people most likely to turn out. Right, I'm going to one more question, because I do my very best to keep this to half an hour, but this has been really popular. I'm interested in this question from Roddy here. Do you think polls and political media are underestimating the impact of the Green Party in this election cycle?
I think some of the polls may be overestimating the Greens. I think Survation polls and Comres polls, simply because of the way they ask the question, they're sort of typically saying that the Greens might win a dozen seats. I think that might be a slight overestimate. But, the Greens are going to be players. They are going to win seats. They might increase the number of seats, or they might hold the number of seats they have. So, yeah, they are going to be significant players. But I think some of the polls may be slightly overstating them a bit.
Great. Well, I think there's definitely a lot of maybes and who knows, and I don't think we're going to have a 4-week period that's ever really going to be as exciting as it is, considering what's happening with everything that's going on. James, really appreciate you spending your time with us, and all the best with Scot Goes Pop, and we'll see you soon. Take it easy. Bye, mate.
Bye.
Well, I hope you all enjoyed that and got loads from it. I would love to hear from any of you if you've got any other suggestions of resources for the Yes movement that we can interview and bring to you. Excuse me, but that's it. That's all for us for now. Happy Easter, and hopefully see you in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks so much.